At the twilight of the 14th century, a fragile peace dangled between two warring kingdoms, England and France. And at the very center of this delicate truce stood a child, barely old enough to read or write, yet expected to embody the hopes of nations. Her name was Isabella of Valois. She was 6 years old when she was chosen to become the bride of King Richard II of England, a man more than 2 decades her senior. To her contemporaries, the marriage was not so much a romance as a gamble. France and England had bled each other for decades in the 100 Years' War, and both courts believed that uniting their royal houses might finally temper the cycle of conflict. But behind the grand ceremonies and carefully negotiated treaties, Isabella was still a child. She clutched dolls in her hands even as ambassadors spoke of her as a guarantor of peace. The wedding itself was not a lavish festival of love, but rather a quiet political ritual, carefully orchestrated. Observers whispered about the absurdity of a 6-year-old queen, but to Richard, the union was less about companionship and more about strengthening his throne. Yet Richard treated Isabella with surprising gentleness. Unlike many monarchs of his age, he did not force the marriage into immediate consummation. Instead, he offered her kindness and patience, treating her almost as a daughter while promising that one day she would grow into her role as his queen. For Isabella, this was a small mercy in a world that rarely offered girls of her rank such tenderness. But the English court was no safe haven. Richard II was a controversial ruler, brilliant in vision yet plagued by mistrust and political enemies. His reign was scarred by rebellion and resentment, and whispers of treachery were never far from the throne. Isabella's presence, meant to symbolize peace, could not shield him from the storm that was gathering. Within 2 short years of their marriage, Richard was deposed by his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, who seized the throne as Henry IV. This was not just the fall of a king, it was the collapse of Isabella's fragile world. Suddenly, the child queen found herself trapped between loyalty to her absent husband and the new reality of a hostile regime. She had no power, no allies in England, and no clear future. Richard was imprisoned and soon dead under suspicious circumstances. Isabella, barely into her teens, was left in limbo, too young to wield influence, yet too valuable as a royal pawn to be released. Henry IV saw her as a potential bargaining chip, and negotiations swirled about her fate. Some urged her remarriage to Henry's son, the future Henry V, as a way to secure legitimacy for the new dynasty. But Isabella resisted. Despite her youth, she carried herself with a dignity that impressed even her enemies. She refused to remarry in England, choosing instead to mourn Richard openly. At an age when most children still played in gardens, Isabella dressed in widow's black, a symbolic act of defiance that declared her loyalty to the man who had once been her husband. Her grief was not only personal, but political. The Valois court in France viewed her situation with alarm, for Isabella was more than a daughter of France. She was the living embodiment of a broken peace treaty. The French king, Charles VI, already unstable due to bouts of mental illness, demanded her return. Yet Henry IV delayed, calculating how best to exploit her presence. Each passing month deepened the tension between the kingdoms. When Isabella was finally permitted to return to France, she crossed the Channel not as a triumphant queen, but as a ghost of failed diplomacy. She was perhaps 12 years old, yet already bore the scars of political maneuvering and personal loss. The child who had once been paraded as a symbol of peace had now become a symbol of betrayal. And yet, despite everything, she endured. Those who saw her return to Paris remarked on her composure, the way she carried herself not as a discarded girl, but as a royal woman who had survived the collapse of 2 courts. She was young, yes, but she had learned already the hardest lesson medieval politics had to teach, that power was fragile and survival demanded patience. This was only the beginning of Isabella's story. Ahead lay another marriage, another transformation, from pawn to partner, from silent bride to active duchess. But for now, the child queen stood on French soil again, no longer England's consort, but still a daughter of Valois. Her life, though bruised by political storms, was far from over. In fact, it was about to take a turn no one had expected. By 1403, Isabella of Valois was no longer the frightened child who had once been paraded through England as Richard II's bride. She was entering her teenage years, and though still very young by modern standards, she had matured under the weight of extraordinary experiences. It was at this delicate moment that a new proposal arose, one that would alter the trajectory of her short life. Charles, Duke of Orléans, her cousin and one of the most influential nobles in France, sought her hand in marriage. He was 29, the same age Richard had been when Isabella first married, but this time the pairing felt different. She was not a 6-year-old child, but a young woman approaching 14, already aware of politics, betrayal, and the cost of being a pawn. To France, the marriage was strategically sound. It kept Isabella within the royal family and removed the danger of her being used by foreign powers. But for Isabella herself, it carried a new possibility, the chance for genuine affection. Charles of Orléans was unlike Richard II in temperament. Where Richard had seemed ethereal and detached from earthly affairs, Charles was passionate, worldly, and deeply invested in culture. A lover of poetry, a patron of the arts, and a man with both military experience and political ambition, he offered Isabella something she had never known in marriage: partnership. When they spoke, he addressed her not as a symbol or a child, but as a woman whose opinions mattered. He told her plainly, "I am not seeking to marry the former Queen of England. I am seeking to marry Isabella of Valois." For a girl who had grown up defined by her title rather than her personhood, these words held immense power. Their marriage negotiations moved swiftly, and in June 1406, Isabella walked down the aisle of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. This time, the ceremony was no quiet diplomatic arrangement. It was a grand affair, designed to display the strength of the Valois dynasty. Isabella, now 16, wore deep blue silk embroidered with golden fleur-de-lis, her hair crowned with sapphires and pearls. Those who watched her procession noted the transformation. Gone was the solemn child bride of England. In her place walked a confident young woman stepping into a new role on her own terms. The marriage proved to be not only politically beneficial, but personally fulfilling. Charles genuinely cherished her. Their court at Blois became a beacon of art and learning, attracting poets, musicians, and scholars. Isabella herself commissioned manuscripts, supported troubadours, and encouraged intellectual exchange between France and foreign courts. She was no longer a passive figure at the edges of political games. She was an active participant, shaping culture and discourse. Motherhood deepened this new chapter of her life. In 1407, she gave birth to a daughter, Jeanne, and unlike many noblewomen who entrusted their infants to wet nurses, Isabella insisted on nursing her child herself. This decision shocked courtiers, but revealed her determination to give her children the affection and presence she had been denied as a girl. Holding her daughter, she whispered vows of protection in both French and English, promising a future less constrained by the political machinery that had ruled her own childhood. But peace never lasted long in medieval France. That same year, Isabella's father-in-law, Louis of Orléans, was assassinated in Paris by agents of the rival Duke of Burgundy. The murder sent shockwaves through the kingdom. For Isabella, it marked the end of domestic calm and the beginning of life under constant threat. Charles inherited his father's titles and responsibilities, becoming one of the most powerful men in France and one of the Burgundians' prime targets. The transformation in their household was immediate. Where once their court had been filled with poetry and laughter, it now bristled with guards and whispered fears. Isabella lived under watch, her letters scrutinized, her movements restricted. She had become not just a duchess, but a figure of survival in the shadow of civil war. Charles himself, once the cultivated poet, hardened with grief and rage, his thoughts bent increasingly toward vengeance. Isabella supported him, but she recognized the danger. France was slipping into a conflict that threatened to devour it, just as England had been consumed by its own internal wars. Even so, Isabella refused to fade into silence. She managed estates in Charles's absence, corresponded with allies, and used her position to provide relief for victims of war. Villagers displaced by violence found shelter through her interventions, and chronicles note her growing reputation as a compassionate leader who remembered not only the nobility, but also the common people. She was no longer the pawn of peace negotiations between kings. She was now a duchess, whose influence reached into politics, culture, and the lives of ordinary families. In these years, Isabella tasted both the heights of love and the depths of looming tragedy. She had gained a husband who saw her as an equal, children who gave her joy, and a court that reflected her intellect. Yet, in the background, the drums of civil war grew louder, promising to test everything she had built. The autumn of 1409 should have been a season of promise for Isabella of Valois. She was still in her early 20s, the mother of a little girl and beloved wife to Charles of Orléans. Her court had begun to recover some of its earlier brightness after the darkness of her father-in-law's murder, and there was hope that peace, however fragile, might take root again in France. But fate, which had already shown her so much cruelty in childhood, was not finished with Isabella. That year, while pregnant with her second child, Isabella's health began to falter. Some chroniclers suggest she suffered from complications of childbirth. Others imply she may have carried the weight of too much grief, stress, and political pressure. Whatever the cause, her strength faded quickly. On September 13, 1409, in the bloom of her youth, Isabella died at the age of just 19. Her death stunned the French court. She was buried in Blois, and though her grave was marked with ceremony, her passing was mourned not in the pomp of dynastic ritual, but in the quiet sorrow of a family torn too soon from a wife, a mother, a daughter. Charles of Orléans, devastated, turned to poetry as his refuge. His verses, preserved to this day, are filled with laments for Isabella. Expressions of love, loss, and longing that paint her not as a political figure, but as the woman who had once been the heart of his world. Her daughter Jeanne grew up without the mother who had once defied convention to nurse her at her own breast. Charles himself would endure captivity in England after the Battle of Agincourt, spending nearly 25 years in exile. Through all this, the memory of Isabella lingered, a reminder of the fragile happiness that war and politics had stolen. Yet Isabella's story did not end with her death. In the centuries that followed, historians and poets alike returned to her figure, drawn to the contrast between her innocence and the brutal weight of the world she inherited. To some, she symbolized the futility of dynastic marriages, those fragile treaties stitched together with the lives of children. To others, she embodied resilience, a young woman who, despite being used as a bargaining chip, managed to carve out moments of dignity, love, and influence. Her life, though brief, also left echoes in the greater arc of European history. The union with Richard II, though tragic, had momentarily stilled the 100 Years' War and revealed just how desperately both kingdoms craved peace. Her second marriage, to Charles of Orléans, bound her name to a dynasty that would later shape France's cultural flowering. And through Charles's poetry, his grief-stricken words for the young woman he lost, Isabella lives on, her presence haunting some of the earliest works of Renaissance lyricism. It is tempting to imagine what might have been had Isabella lived longer. Would she have guided Charles more firmly through the turbulence of civil war? Would her children have grown to play decisive roles in the kingdom's fate? Might she have become, in maturity, one of the great queens or duchesses of France? History offers no answer. What it leaves instead is the image of a girl who entered the stage too soon, a bride before she could be a child, a widow before she could be a wife, and a mother whose story ended before it could be fulfilled. But Isabella's legacy lies precisely in that tragedy. In her short years, she embodied the contradictions of her age: innocence and diplomacy, grief and resilience, silence and influence. Her life reminds us that behind every treaty and dynastic alliance was a human being, often a girl, whose childhood was sacrificed to the ambitions of kings. And so, Isabella of Valois remains not just a forgotten footnote of medieval politics, but a figure worth remembering. Not for the crowns she wore, but for the quiet strength she displayed. Not for the peace she was meant to symbolize, but for the love she found and lost, while navigating a world that rarely allowed her to choose her own fate. Thank you so much for being here until the very end of Isabella's story. If you enjoyed this tale and would like to hear more forgotten chapters of history, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Every click helps us grow and bring more stories like this to life.